book that I'm reading this out of has nothing to do with the quote that I'm about to share with you. But the book is The Grace in Aging that we read for our women's group by Kathleen Singh. But she begins one of her chapters with a quote by Thomas Merton. It says, "If you want to identify me, ask me not where I live, or what I like to eat, or how I comb my hair, but ask me what I'm living for, in detail. Ask me what I think is keeping me from living fully for the thing I want to live for."
Our scripture is from 1 Corinthians. By the grace God gave me, I acted as a wise architect and laid the foundation. Someone else is doing the building, but each of you doing the building must do it carefully. For no one can lay a foundation other than the one already in place, Jesus Christ. You may build on this foundation using gold, silver, precious stones, wood, grass, or straw. Regardless of the material, the day will come when your work will be revealed for what it is. It will be revealed in fire, and the fire will test the quality of your work. If your building survives, you will receive your reward.
Would you pray? Essence of all that is. I know that I'm not the smartest person in the world, or even in this room. That I have my faults, as we all do. And so I pray that perhaps I would simply be a conduit, tapping into the collective unconscious, that river that flows through this world, through our souls, that in tapping in, I might have just a few words worth listening to this morning. May we each be filled with your grace and your peace. May the words of my mouth, the meditations of each of our hearts, be filled with your wisdom and your insight. Amen. So the scripture we have this morning comes from the book of 1 Corinthians, which is one of Paul's letters to the church in Corinth. He'd been going around the Mediterranean, creating little churches, and then keeping in touch with them via letter over the years. So he's probably been gone from Corinth for a couple of years at this point. And he writes back, and he gives us this wonderful metaphor in this scripture. He says, I'm like a wise architect that's laid a foundation for all of you. And that foundation is Jesus. But you each get to build whatever you want onto that foundation. However, keep in mind that what you build, the integrity and the strength of what you build, will one day be tested. So let's flesh out this metaphor, because I think it's a fascinating one and it still applies to all of us today. Every house, you would all agree, needs a firm foundation, right? You got to start there. And the foundation that Paul says we all need to build on, in his case, is the foundation of Jesus. Which I don't take literally, because I'm not seeing Jesus like laying there being our foundation. And I don't really think he means an actual belief in like the person. I think he means what Jesus taught and how he lived. And the fact that he could actually be an example of a human being who could live true to what he taught. Say, I'm not just blowing smoke, I'm walking the walk as well as talking the talk. So what are those things? What is that foundation?
Love.
Love. What else?
Forgiveness.
Forgiveness. Compassion. What else?
Justice.
Unconditional love. I heard something else.
Justice.
Justice. Social justice. Integrity.
Joy.
Joy.
Generosity.
Generosity.
Kindness.
Kindness.
Acceptance.
Acceptance.
Humility.
Empathy. Humility.
Gentleness.
Gentleness. Equality. Taking care of the poor and those less fortunate, those in need. All of those things are the foundation that he gave them. It's interesting to me that so many churches today want to tell you that the foundation is a creed, or is a doctrine, or is the Bible. None of those are the foundation that Paul was talking about. First of all, he didn't have most of those things. But he didn't even say the Jewish tradition and the Old Testament or the Talmud or any of that. That was not the foundation he was saying was so solid and so strong. It was this foundation of everything you just said that we're called to build upon. I think, unfortunately, in our day and time, many people are building on a foundation that is nothing more than illusion. And many people are striving for happiness, and yet what they're going to find out is that what they're trying to build happiness on is fleeting and shallow. We each have the opportunity to build on this solid foundation. But as all of you also probably know, you're never done with the house you're in, right? There's always something more to be done. Something's always breaking, something's never quite finished, something needs to be redecorated or remodeled or torn down or torn off if you're redoing a roof. The structures that we build on the foundation that we're given are changing and evolving as we go through our lives. And that's as it should be. So when we think of what we're building, because this begs the question of all of us, first of all, what foundation are we building our lives on? Our spiritual lives, our lives with the people around us. What foundation are we building on? And what have we built? And does it need to be changed? Because it can be. You can add a room on if you want. You can tear down a wall. You can redecorate, make it look a little better. In fact, you can tear the entire structure down and start over again if you've got a firm foundation. Or at some point in life you can go, boy, my foundation's cracked. And this was not worth building on in the first place. And you can leave that house and you can go find a better foundation and start building again. So what Paul's saying to us is what are you going to build? It's up to each of you. What are you going to build? But whatever it is, build intentionally. Build on purpose. Not necessarily for a purpose, like, oh, I want to be a teacher, or I want to be a lawyer, or I want to grow up to be Sue Perry. But building on purpose, so that each moment that you live adds to the structure that you're building on this wonderful foundation. So that when you come to the end of your life, you can say that what you've built is worthy and will stand the test of time. Which sort of brings us to his next point. Paul goes all Judgment Day on me. And I'm so not a Judgment Day girl. If that's your thing, go for it and just stop listening for a few seconds. I need to reframe Judgment Day. Paul says, there's going to come a day when what you've built is going to be tested. And it's going to be tested with fire. So either it's going to be refined in that fire, or it's going to burn up. Now, he does suggest that nobody's going to be lost in the process of all this. Again, Judgment Day. How do we reframe that? So my question to you is, what kind of life do we build that when we get to the end of our lives, we look back and we can see that it was a life worth celebrating, and that it lives up to the spiritual beliefs and the firm foundation that was laid for it? What does that life look like? What doesn't that life look like? Somebody has the answer? Ding, ding, ding. So, I've done a lot of funerals over the years. And I've sat with people who've talked about, how much they loved the person who was gone, what a wonderful human being they were, and they could go on. And I've sat with families who said, and I've told you some of this, who said, well, I hope you can find something good to say about them. Had two of those back to back, 2 weeks apart. It was not a good month. But I sat with families who could tell stories about the loved one who is gone and talk about their character and laugh and cry and share all of those times. And I've sat with families who couldn't think about stories, who didn't know what to say, who didn't know how to start in describing that person. I've sat with families who have been stoic and unmoving, and I've sat with families who've been overwhelmed with grief. I've sat with families who knew the history of the person intimately and could tell me every little detail of what happened in their life, and I've sat with families who knew like next to nothing. And I'd ask questions, and they'd slowly realize that there was a lot they didn't know about that person. But no matter what kind of person I've sat with in all of my funeral and memorial service planning, there was one thing all of them knew, and that's how that person made them feel. As life goes on, we forget the details. We're not perfect. We don't remember the stories, or we've made up all kinds of stuff with the stories. But we remember how people make us feel, don't we? We remember if they made us feel special and loved and beautiful and smart and kind. We remember how they make us feel. So with every family that I ever sit down with to plan a service, I always ask two questions. One question is to give me one word describing that person. And they each have to give me a different word. And the other question is, what did you learn? Because whether we meet somebody for 5 minutes or 50 years, they typically teach us something. It's not always a good something, but they typically teach us something. And so I ask those two questions, and from those two questions, I get a sense of how someone has built their life and on what foundation. I get a sense of how they've interacted with other people. I get a sense of the strength and integrity of what they've built spiritually and emotionally. And whether that was built on a solid foundation or on shifting sand. Whether it's going to stand the test of time and be a life that's celebrated, or whether it's going to be a life that has caused pain and scars and will hopefully sort of drift off. Rachel Raymond tells a story. Now, she's a psychiatrist and therapist, and she tells a story about a colleague of hers, worked in her office. His name was Hal. Hal was one of these guys who hadn't been sick a day in his life, and then suddenly one day dropped dead of a heart attack at 56. And people were devastated because Hal was this consummate healer and a magnificent friend, and nobody had any clue this was coming. And so his colleagues, his patients were just bereft that he was gone. Well, after a couple of weeks of sorting through things, going through his files, calling his patients, trying to help them find someone else to work with them, they finally started to settle down to life without Hal. And she said, that's when people started showing up. She said she'd come out of her office and she'd look into the waiting room, and there would be one of Hal's clients sitting in the waiting room, and she'd think, oh my gosh, did we forget to call them? Do I have to tell them he's gone? But invariably they all knew that he was gone. They just wanted to be where he had been, where they had felt listened to and truly seen, where someone had made them feel valued and important. And so they came to just sit in that space with whatever was weighing them down, whatever decisions they needed to make. She said that lasted about a year. Many people came just to sit in that space. And that tells me what kind of structure Hal built, and on what kind of foundation he built it. And that it was built in such a way that it was going to stand the test of time. Philip Gully tells a story about a woman named Bernice. So Bernice had a rough life starting from the time she was 8, and her mother died of the flu epidemic in 1918. And she was passed around from relative to relative until she finally got married. And even that wasn't an easy life. And her daughter died when she was 18, and then her husband died, and she lost her eyesight, she lost her hearing, and she got some awful disease called pernicious anemia that turned her tongue black. And yet, if you went to talk to her, all she talked about were her blessings. Philip Gully said, you learn a lot of things in life. You can learn science, and you can learn English, and you can learn math. But if you sat in Bernice's front room and spent time with her, what you learned was prayer and goodness and kindness and how to remember your blessings. What do we build our lives on? What structures do we build? Do they stand the test of time? Going back to the Thomas Merton quote, he says, if you want to identify me, ask me what I'm living for, in detail. And then ask me what's keeping me from fully living what I want to live for. Those are our questions. What are we living for? And what's keeping us from living fully what we want to live for? It's the same thing Paul's asking. What's our foundation? What are we building? What will people remember of us when we're gone? And how we made them feel? I think the answers to these questions will someday really be the only thing that's important. Amen.